I will now hand it over to Dr. Nancy Edwards, Scientific Director of the Institute of Population and Public Health, to start the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica, and hello, everybody. I'm Nancy Edwards. I'm the Scientific Director for the Institute of Population and Public Health at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And I'd just like to say a big welcome to all of you, and particularly to welcome some of our international participants. I realize we have people calling in from many, many different time zones. So for some of you, it may be extremely early in the morning or extremely late at night. I'm going to be joined in this presentation by Alison Jackson. You'll see her page popping up in just a moment. And Alison is the Deputy Director with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and she's been very involved in the work of the Global Alliance for Chronic Diseases, and in particular the development of this request for application. So I'm going to start off, and I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview and some background on the Global Alliance, and then I'm going to hand it over to Alison, who's going to get into some of the details about the request for applications. And I would just encourage you, you can use the chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, the lower right-hand side, where you can type in a message and send it to all participants, and send in your questions as they come to mind, and we will make sure we come back to those at the end and answer those. We'll be taking all questions through the chat box rather than through any other means. So the Global Alliance for Chronic Diseases now has 8 members. You can see the national funding councils that are members of the GACD, and we're extremely pleased that all of them actually are involved in the launch of this call on diabetes. This is our second call. The first call was on the area of hypertension, and at that point we had fewer GACD members. And we're going to explain a little bit about the GACD because this is really about doing some of our research business differently for all of us. And we want you to understand a little bit about the background and how we are working together as a group of funding councils to support this initiative on diabetes. On the Canadian side, we're absolutely delighted that we have the International Development Research Centre joining us in funding applications. And we're very pleased that Greg Cullen and Robert Janot are joining Alison in her office and can help with answering questions that may come in. So Greg and Robert, thanks for joining us today. The mission of the Global Alliance for Chronic Diseases is really to look at how we facilitate joint research on non-communicable diseases in both low and middle income countries, but also among vulnerable communities in high income countries. And each GACD member has defined eligibility for those vulnerable communities differently. So in our case, for example, in the case of Australia, the vulnerable communities, or really communities living under conditions of vulnerability that are eligible for Canada, are Indigenous populations. The mission is also about trying to make sure that those research findings actually get to policymakers and serve as the evidence base for policymakers, so their involvement is really important in the research projects and in the way we bring teams together. And we're also really interested in and looking at innovative collaborations and partnerships. And obviously part of that innovation has to do with how we are working together as funding councils, but there's also other partnerships and innovations that are at play. So the International Development Research Council being involved in the work that we're doing and helping to inform that work is one example. Alliances with WHO and engaging them and engaging senior advisors on the research from a number of countries are just a few examples. The diabetes call, which I think is what you're all really interested in, you'll see that all the GACD members actually have got a version of that call up on their own websites. We're currently accepting applications for CIHR applicants, and funding is expected to commence at the end of 2014. It's important to note that there's some differences in deadlines for the different funding councils, and we'll explain why that's important to note in a few minutes. Overall, at this point, we have approximately $32 million US of funding that will be available across all GACD members. $5 million Canadian dollars of that is coming from Canada, from CIHR and IDRC, as I mentioned. And there's a couple of important websites for you. So one that actually gives information about the call, all deadlines across the GACD partners, frequently asked questions, and background information you can find on that first website listed here, the GACD website. And then the request for applications coming out of CIHR with IDRC on as a partner, we have provided the link to that. If you've got questions, in fact, some of you may need to direct those questions not just to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, but also to some of our other member sites. So the focus of this funding program is about implementation research. And the way we define that in terms of what do we consider to be eligible is that this is research that's looking at what works, for whom does it work, under what contextual circumstances, and how can interventions be adapted and scaled up in ways that ensures that they are accessible and equitable, so that we can get improvements in health status across all population subgroups, not just targeted at, for example, middle income or higher income citizens. And we are aiming through this, and this is the great piece of having all these partners working together, is that we can develop a global network of researchers who are working together to try to understand some of those contexts, the socioeconomic context, the cultural, the geopolitical, the policy, and even the political context, and how those are influencing our results, how findings need to be adapted and applied, and how interventions need to be adapted and applied in different kinds of settings. So the objectives of the GACD calls are to fund research that will generate new knowledge on interventions, and in this case, on their implementation for the primary prevention and treatment of type 2 diabetes. So we have restricted it to type 2 diabetes, and this can be undertaken in low and middle income countries, and we define LMICs as does the World Bank. So for example, it could include Mexico, Argentina, it can include a GACD member country such as India or China or South Africa. So it is that World Bank list that we're using. And it can include Aboriginal populations within Canada. And Australia also is targeting Aboriginal populations. So teams might want to work with Australia, and it can include Aboriginal populations there as well. So we might have some teams coming in wanting to do work only with Indigenous populations in Canada, some teams wanting to do work only with LMICs, and some wanting to do a combination. So this is just a segment of a more detailed version of explanation as to where people need to apply to. And I expect we'll have some questions on this, but I'll just try to give you a quick overview. So this is not showing all possible combinations, but it's showing you some examples. So if a Canadian principal investigator is interested in applying for funds to do work in China, they actually are going to have to submit that through CIHR, and it will have to be submitted by the Chinese principal investigator through the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, which is the GACD partners. And that then will be the funds for the work in China will be paid for by CAMS, and the funds for the work that's being done in Canada with an Indigenous population and or with another lower middle income country could come from Canada. India, if somebody wants to do research with them, it is a requirement that would have to involve research in another LMIC as well as India, or with an Indigenous population Canada. It cannot be research that's only done in India. And in that case, researchers would be applying to the Indian Council of Medical Research and to CIHR. The funds from ICMR would be expended only in India. They're only eligible to be expended in India, but whereas the funds from CIHR could be used in Canada or could be used for the work in another lower middle income country. For those coming in involving countries other than India or China, they might be applying to CIHR. They would be funded through CIHR. But the lower middle income country researchers would actually be funded directly through the International Development Research Center. But they only have to apply through CIHR, and a separate funding agreement will actually be set up between IDRC and the lower middle income country partner, and between CIHR and the Canadian partner. So in each of these examples, in fact, there has to be a principal investigator in the lower middle income countries that are involved. That's a requirement. And then Indigenous communities in Canada and Australia, there they would be applying to CIHR and to the NHMRC, the Australian partners. We can answer more questions about that if people would like more details. So my final slide is this one, just to let you know that there's a joint technical steering committee that will be set up once the researchers have all been notified of who has received awards. This is really important. This is helping to create that global network of researchers that is so important around each of these calls. We already have this committee working for hypertension, co-led by 2 researchers nominated by their peers. This is to bring together people on an annual basis, and they also do work in some working groups. This is to try to foster more cumulative learning across individual research projects to help look at those contextual differences and understand how they are influencing results, and to look at how findings might be adapted and applied in different settings. And you can see a little bit more detail about the Joint Technical Steering Committee for Hypertension if you have a look at the GACD website. So Alison, I'm going to pass it over to you and allow you to explain some of the details regarding the funding opportunities, and I'm just going to pass the ball to you so you can control it.
Terrific, thank you. And maybe you could let me know if you can hear me.
We can hear you just fine, thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Nancy, and welcome everyone, as Nancy said. I will now go through essentially the application and review processes. Again, inviting any questions into the chat along the right-hand side, and we will address those towards the end of the presentation. So here's just a quick snapshot slide of the important dates that I'm sure you're probably all well aware of. We finally got the request for applications launched on December 24th. Appreciating that this was literally the day before Christmas here in Canada, so we apologize for the late release, and we did then extend the letter of intent application deadline to February 19th to try to accommodate this late launch. And we are anticipating the notification of decision of these letters of intent to come out by April 16th. With the full application deadline remaining July 24th and November 30th remaining, which was the original notification of decision date. So we actually didn't modify this at all. So as Nancy has said, within Canada, we have a $5 million envelope to fund applications to a maximum of $400,000 per annum each for up to 5 years. And again, the IDRC will fund the low-middle income teams directly, which is something novel that takes place in Canada. We're the only GACD partner that has additional partners that are able to create that equality, if you will, across the teams, both in the high and low-middle income country settings. And just based on the partnerships as Nancy has described them in that funding table, based on these GACD partnerships, having China and India, for instance, at the table means that CIHR nor IDRC will actually fund the research costs associated with the research teams in India or China. These funds can't be sent across to those countries, but we will pay the Canadian portions respectively, and those partner organizations within those countries will pay the research costs in those countries directly. So the application process, a snapshot overall, we'll have an eligibility screen once we receive the applications, ensuring that the eligibility as labeled in the request for applications is sound for all applications. Then we proceed to a relevance review, and again, the relevance review criteria are in fact all listed clearly in the funding opportunity. We have a duplicate assessment screen, which essentially means that no applications can apply to more than one high-income country global alliance partner. So, for instance, if their team has a UK and a Canadian component, you must apply to either the UK or CIHR, the MRC UK or CIHR, for your application to be funded by one of those high-income countries. And obviously, with the exception of India and China, where we expect there to be a duplicate, if you will, research proposal submitted to ICMR or CAMS, which I will describe a little bit later on. The assessment will take place prior to releasing the letter of intent peer review results, and if it is found that, for instance, an application came into Canada and the US, that application will be withdrawn. So unfortunately, we can't allow duplicate applications to be submitted to more than one GACD partner country, with the exception of obviously India, China, and potentially with Indigenous populations within Canada and Australia. Then we'll have a letter of intent peer review process. So once all the applications have been screened in for eligibility and relevance, they will proceed to essentially a virtual peer review process at the letter of intent stage. So this is an at-home review done by the peer reviewers. And then once those applicants have been provided a rating, they will either be invited to the full application or not invited to the full application stage, and then we'll have the applications come in at the full application stage, and those will be peer reviewed in an international joint review process, which I will get to in a moment. So eligibility, the nominated principal applicant and co-principal applicants in low-middle income countries must be independent researchers as defined by CIHR, which is, if you click on the link, you will find what we qualify that as. So teams must include researchers who are based in Canada and low-middle income countries as defined by the World Bank. Exceptions here would be research within Canada's Aboriginal populations. In these cases, having an international partner is not a requirement. It is obviously an enhancement. As Nancy spoke about the hypertension program, we did have an application there that included both Indigenous populations as well as low-middle income country populations, which was fantastic. So that is absolutely welcomed. As well as researchers with Canadian Aboriginal populations may also include co-principal investigators or co-investigators from Australia and or, like I said, low-middle income country projects focused on Indigenous populations. Demonstrated engagement of decision and policy makers in the project must be included. Decision makers and or policy makers must be listed as applicants on the proposal, demonstrating this engagement at the onset. The nominated principal applicant from Canadian and low-middle income country combined teams must include 2 principal applicants registered at a low-middle income country institution and a Canadian institution. So 1 from each. I hope that's clear. It might not be from the way we've worded it. So 2 principal applicants, 1 from Canada, 1 from the low-middle income country, both at registered eligible institutions. IDRC will be ensuring that the institutions in the low-middle income countries are in fact IDRC eligible institutions, and that screen will take place. Applicants may not apply to 2 different, as I said, GACD agencies with the same project. Doing so is grounds for withdrawal. Obviously, with the exception of China and India, where applications must be submitted to both competitions in order to be considered eligible, as well as South Africa will be doing a relevance review just to make sure that any applications that come through to a GACD partner with a South African researcher, that researcher is actually eligible to be considered a South African researcher. So some of the requirements, and I hope that I'm not shooting through this too quickly, and again, I see Nancy is answering questions on the right, so please feel free to continue that, and I will go through some of the partner eligibility, and I appreciate that this can be complex, so please feel free to either send questions now or any time throughout the application process. So when you're applying to China, India, or South Africa Medical Research Council, applicants must be eligible to apply and respect the rules of those GACD partner organizations as stated in their funding opportunities, as well as the CIHR funding opportunity. So I invite you, implore you, if you will, to visit their sites to make sure that you meet all of the requirements of both application processes. And you can, as Nancy has stated and is included in an earlier slide, there's a GACD website that has, that we've included the link to, and it links directly to a page that has links directly to all of the GACD funding opportunities. Applicants will need to submit identical research proposals to both competitions to be considered in China and/or India. And by that, it is the research proposal component. All other requirements for those particular funding agency rules will need to be abided in each. And applicants will need to be deemed fundable by both review processes to actually receive the funding. So we will respect rank order in both of those peer review competitions. And if an application is considered fundable in both, it is only then that they could be considered for funding depending on rank order. So as I stated, CIHR will be conducting a relevance review, and that's essentially to ensure that researchers are responding to this call, that they're focusing on a wide range of prevention and/or treatment strategies for type 2 diabetes. The RFA actually has a description and a listing of examples of relevant research areas, so I invite you to go and check those out. They will probably prove very helpful. As well as reviewing the GACD partner sites for listings of specific criteria for various competitions. For instance, in China, the Chinese PI must be with CAMS in order to be considered in the competition. So as I stated earlier, the full application review will be done through a joint international review panel, and this panel will have CIHR, the Medical Research Council of UK, as well as NHMRC in Australia. And at the full application stage, CAMS applications will be reviewed through the CIHR, MRC, and NHMRC methods. So there's one panel essentially reviewing all of the applications from those countries, but it's important to note that applications are not competing across those GACD partner agencies. We're essentially sharing a review panel, and we'll probably each have our separate day, but this actually ensures that we have consistency across the review processes. We will all be utilizing the MRC UK rating scale, for instance, for ease of use at the peer review process. And it will help for instance, any for CIHR CAMS applications and MRC CAMS applications. They can all be reviewed by the same panel, and that helps with balancing things out when it comes back to decision-making time. So as you can see, there will be parallel review processes taking place for sure in India, and that is, it's a one-step process at the full application stage. India will be conducting its own peer review, and applications must be considered eligible as well as fundable in India, as well as through, for instance, the CIHR review process to be considered for funding, as I've stated, I think repeatedly now. China will review the letters of intent for relevance only, and then we'll defer to, so for instance, Canada's full application review for funding decisions. So if a CIHR CAMS application comes through, China will ensure at the letter of intent stage that it's relevant. The full application will come to Canada. Canada will run it through its peer review process, and if CIHR deems it fundable and is able to fund it, then CAMS will pick it up with us. And so the Chinese component will be paid by CAMS, and the Canadian component will be paid by CIHR. The South Africa MRC will also deem teams eligible and will defer, as China is, to the high-income country full application review for funding decisions. So again, if CIHR deems it fundable and will fund it, then South Africa will participate in that. The evaluation criteria as listed in the funding opportunity are the relevance and quality of the project, quality of the team, project implementation plans will be reviewed, as well as the potential impact. So the next slide you'll see, we go into a bit more detail, and you can actually find more description for each of the previously described evaluation criteria on the funding opportunity. So in addition to the ones I just described, all applications must describe system barriers, healthcare and otherwise, to treatment and prevention of type 2 diabetes and how these can be addressed, system facilitators and how these will be leveraged within the project scope, how decision makers and other knowledge users will be engaged in the project, and again, decision and policy makers must be included as applicants on the application, so that is a strong demonstration of engagement from the onset. An implementation component, as Nancy had described, the implementation focus of this call, it should involve strategies with demonstrated efficacy and effectiveness, and may also include the development of new strategies. Applications should include an assessment of equity and gender gaps and the needs of vulnerable populations in treatment and prevention of type 2 diabetes, and Nancy has described some of what we consider to be, across the different countries, vulnerable populations. The multidisciplinary composition of research teams must be noted. An appropriate plan for knowledge translation and exchange. Links and definitions of websites will be provided as a component of the project, as well as a training plan for research capacity development, which is a priority of the overall Global Alliance. So as Nancy had described a bit previously, the Joint Technical Steering Committee is one of what we consider to be a condition of funding. So as part of this, an annual report will need to be submitted. This goes to CIHR as well as IDRC on an annual basis. The Joint Technical Steering Committee meets, governs, it shares learning across as well, all the way down to standard metrics to ensure that cumulative learning and sharing data. And there's actually language in terms of whether or not you need to include your legal department for the sharing of data throughout the life of your project. And everyone participates on this Joint Technical Steering Committee. There is an annual meeting, and it really does create a community of researchers within the scope of disease focus, as well as a global alliance, really, and it's working quite nicely so far. In addition, excuse me, those teams focused on Aboriginal communities will also be expected to interact with one of the signature initiatives here at CIHR, the Pathways to Health Equity for Aboriginal People's Health, and they're funded teams through that initiative. Excuse me. So here's a snapshot of contact information on who to send any requests for information and questions to. Excuse me. Maureen Stoddard and Natalie Gravel are actually in the room with me now, and they've been working hard on answering any questions that have come in to date, as well as myself and Nancy. We're always available. Excuse me. So I will invite Nancy to speak to, I'm hoping she's had the chance to review some of the questions, and we will review them here. And now is a terrific time for anyone to, send their questions. So
that's great. So thanks very much, Alison. And why don't I get started with some of these questions, and please pitch in if you've got additional responses, or if I get it wrong, which is within the realm of possibility. So we've got some great questions coming in. One here is whether or not you can look at an approach, an intervention concurrently in India and within Canada with South Asian communities. So the answer is that the South Asian communities in Canada are not considered an eligible population within Canada. We have chosen to restrict our eligibility criteria for vulnerable populations in Canada to Aboriginal, Indigenous people of Canada, and therefore, in order to apply, you would have to be involving either another lower middle income country other than India, or to turn your attention to work with Indigenous populations in Canada. And certainly within India, as you probably know, Kaveri, the indigenous populations of India are a priority within ICMR, so that might be an interesting kind of connection to explore. Somebody else, there's been a few questions I think about principal applicants. So you must have, to apply for CIHR funding, you must have a principal applicant at a nominated CIHR institution within Canada. They have to be an approved institution to whom CIHR can send funds. And then there has to be a principal applicant from the lower middle income country. And the funds from IDRC will be going to that principal applicant in the lower middle income country. So they are the nominated PI for the LMIC. Now, what we did with hypertension, and I assume this is also what we'll do with this initiative, is that, let's say, 2 LMICs were involved. Let me just go back to Mexico and Argentina as examples. Then in that case, there would be a principal applicant in Mexico, a principal applicant in Argentina, and a principal applicant in Canada. And IDRC would likely have a separate agreement with Mexico and another agreement with Argentina, and then CIHR would be flowing the funds to the Canadian investigators for the work that's going to be done in Canada. They might also involve somebody from a higher income country. We actually had a team last time that involved a co-principal applicant from the UK. They chose, for a variety of reasons, to submit that to CIHR, but there is actually a co-PI, but the funds don't go from CIHR to the co-PI in the UK, but there were funds flowed from CIHR to the Canadian institution, and then they actually flowed to the co-PI in the UK, and there were LMICs involved in that as well. So I hope that helps to answer that one. And I think there was a couple of other questions about Canadian PIs. So certainly you could have from James Elliott, you certainly could have co-PIs involved from a Canadian NGO, but unless the Canadian NGO is a CIHR designated institution, they are not eligible to receive funds directly from CIHR. So you would have to involve a nominated PI from most likely an academic institution that can receive CIHR funds, and then perhaps the individual from the Canadian NGO might wish to be on as either a co-applicant or as a co-PI. Do research projects have to target one country, or can they target a specific population in multiple countries? No, they don't have to target one country, not at all. However, a researcher can come in saying, I just want to work with Indigenous populations in Canada, and that's fine. That would be eligible. They might come in and say Indigenous population in Canada, and they want to work in Jamaica. That would also be eligible. Can they work with specific populations in multiple countries, such as the scenario you have here, refugees in
Nancy, we can't hear you anymore. I'm not sure if you're still speaking.
I'm assuming that unless people are sending in a note here that they are able to hear me. So I'll just keep going in the hopes that I'm getting through. With respect to pathways, this is a signature initiative, a strategic initiative that we're operating through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And some of you will see that there's perhaps some similar requirements for the GACD initiative as there will be for the implementation research teams under the Pathways initiative. So Pathways is not going to be funding lower middle income country research. They will be funding research with Indigenous populations in Canada. If you are interested and wondering, because you're working only with Indigenous populations in Canada, do I apply to the GACD or do I apply through Pathways or can I do both? Here's the answer. So you could apply to the GACD for this initiative with an Indigenous population in Canada only. Assuming you were successful, then end of story. If you were unsuccessful in that, you would want to take the reviewer's comments that you got, and you would be eligible once the application period for GACD is all finished to take that application and apply to Pathways. And we anticipate that the Pathways RFA will be coming out after we have gotten through the peer review process for the GACD. So in a sense, you kind of get, I suppose, 2 kicks at the can. But that does not apply for investigators that involve LMICs. Somebody asked about the amount of money we have. So it is a total of $5 million. That's the CIHR money and the IDRC money for the 5-year period. That's not $5 million per year. And the $32 million available through GACD is the amount over the 5-year period. So thanks for that, requesting that clarification. Now, for an individual applicant, since you're looking at, funding perhaps from Canada and from India, if it was a joint initiative, then in fact, only a portion of your money is coming from CIHR, and a portion of your money for the work in India is coming from India. And the CIHR funds, again, would be paying for work in Canada, for example, with Indigenous populations and or work in another lower middle income country. There was a question about I suppose, the eligibility, the focus of this in terms of the relevant research areas. That is outlined in the RFA, so you might want to look at that in detail. We identify that researchers can focus on a wide range of prevention and or treatment strategies, including, community-wide approaches where there's strategies targeting individuals at risk or strategies that are targeting the environmental situation that is making healthy choices very difficult for people. Structural interventions or policies are included. So I think if you have a look at that more detailed list, hopefully that answers that question, but we're happy to elaborate. And I would just advise you, if you're wondering if your topic area is eligible, then don't ever hesitate to pick up the phone and get a hold of us or send an email. We certainly want to make sure that you're not preparing an application that's outside of the eligibility requirements. Alison, what else do we have here? You've been answering some of the questions as well. Yeah, I think we've made our way through most of the questions. Alison, is there anything else in particular that you'd like to try and emphasize? There's something that I didn't get quite right here in my responses, or anything that Greg or Robert would like to add?
So from my perspective, I think you have done a terrific job at answering the questions. Did we address this most recent one? Can all applicants be from Canada? So the short answer would be only if you're working with Indigenous populations within Canada can all of the applications be from Canada. Otherwise, we are looking for Canadian LMIC collaborations, as well as Indigenous populations within Australia and any other country, really. So no, not all applicants can be from Canada in those contexts, but only if there are Indigenous communities.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I think this is a really important principle that we want to underscore about how the GACD is operating. This is not about a model of Canada providing some technical assistance and Canadian researchers being able to go over to whatever country and collect their data, and then bring it back. And I'm sure you can all appreciate that the essence of the Global Alliance for Chronic Disease is doing this work together. We're on an even playing field. Researchers from Canada and researchers from other countries all bring their own expertise and experience to the table. And the requirement of principal investigators in other countries is fits with that. So hopefully that helps. Somebody's asked about animal work. Alison, you'll have to tell me whether or not we've actually explicitly excluded that, but that's really not what the focus is of this research. Go ahead, Alison.
Sorry, I don't believe we've excluded it specifically. We haven't invited it in that context, but I don't believe it's a specific exclusion.
So my advice would be, looking at the focus of this on implementation science and the evaluation criteria, that perhaps there would be something that you feel is a necessary part of a kind of a program of research that might involve some animal work. But if that came in as a major focus of this, it would not be considered eligible. It would be out of the competition. This is about implementation science, which is what works for whom, under what circumstances, what context, and how do we scale it up. So it really must have that very much as the primary focus. Of course, there will be teams that say, we've got to do a little bit of work on measurement here. We need to do some work on looking at an in-depth understanding of the context that's going on. Those certainly are all very much within the parameters of what we're doing. But if a team came in and said, we just want to develop a measurement tool to be able to actually look at scale up, that would be insufficient. That would not be deemed eligible either. So, Don, I hope that answers your question. Anything else? Alison, I think you've answered this other question here.
Yes, but just to reiterate, it is integral to ICMR's call that research and research teams applying to ICMR must be doing research both in Canada and in India in order to be considered eligible to apply to the ICMR competition. So the data management, etc., being handled in Canada and the research taking place in India would not be what they would consider eligible. So research must be conducted both within Canada as well as India.
Yeah, and I guess just as sort of more background, something I didn't say is that the development of the RFA was done jointly by all members of the Global Alliance for Chronic Disease. We all agreed on the focus, and we all agreed on the evaluation criteria, and we all agreed on what's in and what's out. So there are some, if you look at what's on the website for India or for the EU Commission, you'll see maybe some differences in wording and so on, because we had to fit it into some other requirements of our respective organizations, but we're all aiming to fund the same kind of research. But there are requirements of the different funding organizations, and this is where Alison's really important advice to look at the requirements of ICMR, for instance, if you're applying to India as well, is really, really important. And certainly we can have colleagues involved, trainees, PhD students and postdocs who may come from a variety of LMICs or from Indigenous populations within Canada or possibly Australia. The EU Commission has their model of funding, for example, is that they require that they have to have 3 EU member countries as part of their application. So again, go back and have a look at the GACD member requirements. I think some of you too may be wondering, well, where do I apply? Do I choose to apply to the EU Commission, or do I apply to Canada? Do I apply to India? Do I apply to Canada? So you're going to have to look at what are the requirements for either a co-application. An application to India alone is not a GACD application. They want to involve other LMICs or Indigenous populations in Canada or Australia as part of the work they're doing. Otherwise, it's like business as usual, and it's what they would fund through their normal granting mechanism. If we're missing questions here because we're trying to scan as we talk, please make sure. Somebody based in India, Vandana, thanks for your question. Can you give an example of the model for collaboration with a Canadian researcher? So yes, by all means, you would have for an application to CIHR and to ICMR, because you'd be applying Vandana to ICMR, and the Canadian would be applying to CIHR, same application. Then let's imagine that you would be interested in working with Indigenous populations in northern India, and you're working with a researcher who's interested in working with Indigenous populations in Canada. That would be one scenario. Another scenario is that you're interested in working with, let's say, the rural poor in India, or women who are experiencing gestational diabetes in India. So for the Canadian, they might be interested in doing similar work in another country, let's say Malaysia or Indonesia. So you would join forces to sort out what it is that you're wanting to do, why having those countries involved is important to your research aims, and then you would be submitting to ICMR. The Canadian would submit to CIHR. It would be reviewed by ICMR, reviewed by CIHR, and then assuming that it's considered fundable by both and highly ranked, it would be funded by both. Alison, do you want to add to that and make sure I got it right?
I think you did get it right. So
okay.
I think we're trying to simplify a relatively complicated process. And if there's questions, then I implore people to contact us as soon as they know what those are. You'll see also, moving on, that I got a question privately of whether or not natural experiments are desirable. And so the short answer to this is that they are absolutely eligible. Desirable is wording I probably wouldn't necessarily apply in any context here, but definitely eligible.
Absolutely eligible, as are a whole range of methodologies that people might use. I think we'll probably see a number of mixed methods, designs, research applications coming in, because the nature of implementation science is such that they may lend themselves to that. Can funding be controlled by the PI in Canada, or must some flow directly to the PI in the LMIC? So in the case, Brian, that you are applying to CIHR, and I'll just make it up, you're doing work in, let's say, Brazil. Then in that case, the Brazilian portion of the work we would expect to be funded by IDRC, and the funding is going to flow directly from IDRC to Brazil. So the funding actually is under the direct control of the Brazilian PI, who is work that might involve a research assistant or whatever in Canada. The team is obviously going to want to spell out their governance mechanisms and so on that you're going to have for perhaps for decision making, because you've got two sort of controls of the funds in this case. But I hope that answers your question in terms of how that will work. And Alison, you're busy answering another question there.
I was actually answering that question, Nancy. Sorry, IDRC is paying the LMICs directly, with the exception of China and India, and so right, the control would rest with the LMIC PIs.
And in the case of China and India, then the Indian PI is going to get their money from ICMR, so they actually are controlling and accountable for the funds they're getting from ICMR, and the Canadian is accountable for the funds they're getting from CIHR. Same thing in China, work in China, The Chinese portion of it is going to a Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences CAMS researcher at a CAMS organization who is accountable for the funds. In China, I'll just clarify that one of the things that they're doing is that only a CAMS researcher can receive, CAMS designated researcher can receive the funds directly. So they become the nominated PI, but they can involve other Chinese researchers from other institutions within China. So I think that's important to know because that's an example of how they're doing their business a little bit differently as a result of the GACD. But it would be important to ask questions, any clarification questions about that of the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences. And I don't think they have actually released the RFA yet, but we're anticipating that should be up any day. And it is going to be released, if I understand correctly, actually only in English. So it will be presumably readable by anybody who's on this call. So somebody's asking if the study population is in an LMIC country, what would the funds from CIHR in Canada be used for? So if it is an LMIC country other than India, other than China, then it's going to be used for the work that's being done. The IDRC funds will go to the LMIC country, but you're going to have people who are principal applicants in Canada who are part of the team. There's going to be some travel costs. There's going to be costs for meetings. There may be a research assistant involved in Canada, for example, who's doing maybe an economic part of some analysis that's planned as part of the study. So it's going to really vary from one country to another. But for the work that's actually being done in the LMIC, it will be IDRC funds going to the LMIC. And if it's work being done in China or India, then China and India are paying for all the work being done within those countries. I hope that helps. Alison, do you want to respond to the question about the LOI format?
Absolutely. So I just wrote it. I'm not sure if it's shown up yet, but the LOI format is the one posted in the request for applications. And so within the space provided, by all means, answer the evaluation criteria and any questions that you feel are posed within the tasks. But definitely you must follow the format listed in the How to Apply section labeled in the request for applications. It won't let you submit if you don't follow all of the standard processes.
And Alison, I see that you've answered the question regarding the IDRC countries that are eligible. Essentially, it's as per the GACD definition.
The world definitions, I didn't answer that one, but there was a question about IDRC eligible institutions or researchers. And so having received confirmation, all of the ones that were listed in the question are considered eligible institutions.
And do you want to answer the question about institute signatures needed for the LOI?
I will find that question now.
Okay, it just came in. Do you need institute signatures for LOIs? So while you're pondering that, I'll just answer a couple of other things here. I think Alison's point about, making sure that you're really looking carefully at the evaluation criteria that are going to be used to peer review and respond right directly to those, so that there's no doubt about what a stellar, team you are, and the relevance and quality of your project and your project implementation plan and so on. So have a careful look at those. Is there expected to be a training component? Brian, thanks for that question. The answer is essentially yes. We're looking for, how are you actually planning to work as a team to build in capacity building and training, and that's going to look really different across the different applications. But certainly be thinking about it as you develop the plans for the work that you're going to be doing.
And to go back to answer the institutional signatures, yes, they are a requirement at the letter of intent stage.
And those are would be you know, good questions if they come up. Where again, certainly inquire if you've got any questions, any doubts at all. We would much rather get the calls rather than you're finding out that something you missed something because you didn't understand it. And making sure that if you're working with another a PI in another country who is applying has to also submit their application to one of the GACD funding partners, that they have done the same thing on their end, so that you're dotting all those I's and crossing the T's. I see that we're close to the end of time, so I think I'll just make one comment and then pass it over to Alison to see if she has anything to say before we wrap up. And that is just we're delighted so many of you could join us. We're really excited about this initiative. This is about doing things differently, and the Joint Technical Steering Committee annual meetings are really interesting, and we've got teams that are starting to work differently together. They've built new sets of networks, and we're anticipating exactly the same sort of thing will come out of the diabetes work. We're actually in discussion right now about how we might bring the diabetes teams and the hypertension teams together in the future, but these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about as we move ahead. So Alison, anything you wanted to add? And then it's just one more question we might want to answer.
I'm just answering the one from James Elliott regarding the eligible institutions from IDRC. Having them in the room is quite helpful. So any legal entity essentially can act as an eligible institution to receive and issue funds for IDRC researchers. And so they don't have a listing of these eligible institutions. However, there's no pre-application requirement. So submit your LOI. If it's not already a recognized or an ongoing partnership, if you will, with an organization, IDRC will engage at that point. So there's no requirement to have a pre-approval done prior to submitting that LOI.
And I see one final question has come in from Bandana Jane, asking whether or not work relating to developmental origins, for example, growth patterns in infancy and later risk of insulin resistance fits with this call. If that is the exclusive focus of the project, that is not a fit with this call. That would not be deemed eligible. As you have described it there, Vandana, that has no implementation science focus. It certainly does have implications for those doing implementation science, but if I understand your question here, it is not an implementation science question. Our knowledge about that might influence our approach to implementation, and if you're wanting to look at an implementation approach, then that's where you can kind of build that in. But as a primary focus, that does not fit within the call. So thanks. Yeah, I think the concrete examples are very helpful to work with. So with that, I think we better wrap up. Alison and I will both just stay on the line for a few more minutes to see if anything else comes in on the chat functions. And we just want to thank you all for your time and look forward to your questions and, of course, to your applications. So thanks very much. Alison, anything from you?
No, but thank you all for participating and spending the time and providing very insightful questions today.
Bye for now.